Language and education policies and Indigenous language revitalization efforts in Canada. So before we begin, we acknowledge that we are on traditional territories in Alberta of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. Um, so this article is by the Faculty of Education actually in University of Victoria, and why it is important for inclusive education is because, well, Indigenous knowledge and languages help us develop respect for others, conserve the environment, and essentially it's a vital part of the human connection and understanding. Thus, my thesis is the current aspects and improvements for Indigenous policies and curriculum for inclusive education. And the keywords are Indigenous language practices, language and educational policies, policy reform, FNMI, Global North, and Global South. So this statement that I have below is within the article itself, and it says, ensuring inclusive and equitable equality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So this is by the United Nations, as you can see, and it's quite interesting because they are aware of the importance of Indigenous languages and knowledge. So often in the media, they tend to focus on the negative aspects, as we have learned throughout our course. And similarly, it's the same for Indigenous languages. They would rather focus on the loss rather than the recovery. Although there are an estimated 3,000 Indigenous languages globally that are in danger, Statistics Canada, however, has shared the rate with which new Indigenous language speakers are being created is beginning to outpace the rate at which speakers are being lost. And this is especially true in the Global South. And this is mostly due to the youth being actively engaging and the revitalization work that is occurring, which is mostly done in the Indigenous communities themselves. Moving on to the Canadian context. So Indigenous language remain marginalized in the Global North, unfortunately, whereas in the Global South, actually non-dominant languages have been flourishing. So I say unfortunate mostly because, well, there are 90 languages of Indigenous peoples in Canada, which are being marginalized. So global North versus the global South. The global South does not have the vocabulary such as the revitalization or language maintenance, and hence they use the idea of mother tongue based education, or MTB for short. And essentially what MTB implies is that education is directed towards enabling children to have a best chance in school by conducting programs in the first language. Whereas in the global North, the non-dominant language, especially spoken in home, is extremely devalued in the wider society. So it makes revitalization approaches quite difficult, mostly due to the fact that finding adults who are sufficiently proficient in non-dominant language to the point where they are able to teach, especially beyond the early years. So what needs to be done is that we need an immediate priority for teachers. So moving on to the Indigenous language education policies. In Canada, as we know, historically, schools have been explicitly hostile to Indigenous language acquisition. As we know, the genocidal history that has led to near extinction of Canada's Indigenous language wealth. And of course, I think we all know the historical aspects related to the residential schools that we learned about even in this course, and the little Indigenous language that were permitted in or outside the classroom. And of course, the Canadian government not keeping up their promise to revitalization of Indigenous languages. Regarding the official languages, in most of the provinces and territories, they have the two official languages, which are English or French. Whereas Nunavut and Yukon actually are quite interesting because they are the only two territories that provide specific support for Indigenous bilingual or immersion programs. So moving on to this project, I thought it would be interesting to mention this project and important because, well, I don't quite know how to pronounce it. So for the sake of the presentation, I'll just call it project because I do not want to butcher it. And it stands for One Mind, One People. And what's interesting about it is this is an Indigenous-led countrywide capacity strengthening initiative. Um, and it's built on 5 themes, and the goal is to essentially share knowledge, document successful language programs, strengthen leadership capacity, and create political pressure to create enabling federal, provincial, and territorial policies that provide meaningful support for Indigenous language retention, revitalization, and recovery. And also I have put the website if anyone is interested. So the insights from the Global South. Canada has a great diversity of Indigenous languages and dialects, creating challenges for a countrywide approach to language retention. So in that sense, the Global South is actually very similar because they also have much diversity in their languages. And the grassroots efforts have tend to focus on the children's acquisition of the Indigenous languages, whereas the lack of language proficient adults in Canada compared with Global South, there's a more investment in that sense. So what that means is the Global South is putting more investment in the financial and technical resources, whereas the Global North, not so much, because the Global South makes teaching, or sorry, believes that teaching is essential when it comes to Indigenous languages. So there's a difference with the Global South and Global North there. Another difference is that Canada lacks the enabling policy provisions that are now moving into place in a growing number of countries or regional entities in Global South. So from the global perspective, Canada could be considered a forerunner actually in recognizing the distinct language, context, and current circumstance while working collaboratively with Indigenous communities toward recognition and action. Unfortunately, Statistics Canada does tell us that no Indigenous languages are safe. So, conclusion. The article essentially describes the Indigenous language education and language policy in Canada and compares it with the language policy in the Global South. And what needs to be done is, as I've listed, the Canadian government needs to take responsibility instead of just kind of throwing money, and actually that's what they usually do for the most part, just throw money and hope for the best. So they should instead support these projects and learn from these projects and help build them. And also the media should focus on recovery instead of the loss. And always we can learn from the Global South and their programs, such as those with the MTB. And yeah, this is my references. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.